Today's daf is daf nun aleph. And we'll begin about 7, 8, 9 lines down from the top with the word v'tizbara. Now, just to reiterate, we have a machlokas here about whether ikar shira b'peh or ikar shira b'kli. And Rabbi Yossi Maika Sovar, the way that it was interpreted until this point, Rabbi Yossi was the Tana who was of the opinion that ikar shira b'kli. But now we have a problem. Why? Because we just quoted a brisa in which Rabbi Yossi is recorded as saying that at the time of the Nisach HaMayim on Sukkah, they took Yisraelim Yuchasim from Mishpachos Miyuchasos to play the instruments. Ikar savar ikar shira b'peh. If you're going to tell me that shira is b'peh and the musical instruments are a secondary accompaniment, then anyone could blow the flute or play the cymbals, etc., etc. Is afilu avodim nami. Why did Rabbi Yossi restrict those who would play the instruments to mishpachos miyuchasos b'Yisrael? Why couldn't he accept the opinion of the first Tana? That was Rabbi Meir, who said that even avodim, even slaves that don't have yichus, can play the instruments. So we have no choice, but rather ikasaver ikar shira b'kli, that as an integral part of the avoda of Nisach HaMayim, we need the instruments to play. If that be the case, Leviim in, Yisraelim lo. The avoda of Nisach HaMayim, which is accompanied now by the singing of the Leviim, has a requirement of instrumental playing by the Leviim. The Leviim are the ones who are in charge of this avoda and doing the singing. And if the instruments are the main primary focus of this avoda, then it's the Leviim who should be actually in charge of playing the instruments. So we have this middle shita of Rabbi Yossi that doesn't fit here nor there. He doesn't fit into the mold of ikar shira b'peh, because if that be the case, even avodim should be able to play these instruments. He doesn't fit into the mold of ikar shira b'kli, because if that be the case, then the Levium would be required to play the instruments. Ella, says the Gemara, we're going to have to now reject the original explanation, which, by the way, as we saw yesterday, was Rav Papa's explanation, that the issue here is whether ikar shira b'peh or ikar shira b'kli. No, Kuli Alma, everybody agrees universally that ikar shira b'peh. This is a universal assumption. And therefore, if you're going to hold that ikar shira b'peh, as we said before, even avodim should be able to play the instruments. Why did Rabbi Yossi disagree with Rabbi Meir and insist that the instruments be played by mishpachos b'Yisrael, miyuchasos b'Yisrael, v'hakam mifligi? Demar savar hachi avi ma'isa, umar savar hachi avi ma'isa. Who actually played the instruments before, in actuality, back at the time of Nisach HaMayim? And according to one opinion, it was the avodim. According to another opinion, it was the Yisraelim HaMiyuchasim. According to the third opinion, it was none other than the Leviim. L'may nafkamina. Why would they argue about such a thing? My dahava hava, whatever was, that's history. And by the way, if anyone could open up their camera, I would really, really appreciate it, because it's very difficult for me to give a shir to just, I don't know if there are people behind these names or anything. Thank you, I appreciate that. The machlokas is about what we call mylin. Mylin means, I'll give you the classic case of mylin. If you want to know whether Kohen is miyuchas or not, the Gemara establishes in the Masechet Ksubis on Daf Chaf Hey that if this Kohen served in the Beis Hamikdash, then we know that he's miyuchas, that he's checked out and he's kosher. Otherwise, they wouldn't have let him. serve on the Mizbeach. And now the question is, what's the status of a person who plays instruments in order to accompany the song of the Levian? Do we have a halach of Mailim, which means that we know from the fact that they gave him the okay, they gave him the license, the geshpanka, to play these instruments, that means that he must be miyuchas, is according to one man diyamar, Mailim miduchan liyuchsin ulamaiser, that's the opinion. Therefore, if people will come to the conclusion that they wouldn't have let these individuals play the instruments to accompany the Nisach HaMayim unless they were checked out and they had kosher yuchasim, then we have to be very careful if we allow avodim to play these instruments or Yisraelim who are not yuchasim, then people might come to the mistaken conclusion that these individuals are yuchasim. Is according to Rabbi Meir Kasavar ein ma'ila miduchen liyuchsin v'lo l'maseh. We will not rely on the fact that a person was designated for playing these instruments and therefore establish him to be a kosher. He might be an eved. No one's going to think that because he was playing the instruments, oh, he must be a Yisrael kosher. Because no one thinks that the instruments have to be played as part of the essential avodah like cherem. Uman Yomi Yisrael hayu, but now we get to Rabbi Yossi who insists that they were makbid not to allow avodim to play the instruments. He's of the opinion that kosover mailin miduchan liyuchsin, that those who would play the instruments, the people would assume they were already checked out and they got the official license that they are miuchasim, and therefore we have to be very careful and make sure that the people who are blowing the instruments are miuchasim. Avalola maiseh. As far as assuming that the people would gather the conclusion that the person who's blowing the instruments is a Levi, and therefore he would receive Maaser, that even Rabbi Yossi says is not a serious suspicion. No one's going to assume that the person who's blowing the instruments, like the flute that we spoke about, the Khalil, which is the name of that parak, that he was a Levi. Nobody thinks that you need a Levi to play the Khalil. But according to that opinion, which was the third opinion in this brisa, that insisted that it was the Leviim who were in charge of playing the instruments, that's because Mailim Lemaser, people would suspect that if he was playing the instruments, he must be a Levi. They checked him out, and he's a Levi miyuchas, he's kosher. So we have to avoid using a Yisrael, even a Yisrael miyuchas, should not qualify, and that was the opinion of Rab Chanina ben Antignos. Now the Gemara comes up with a whole new twist on everything that we learned yesterday about Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda and the Chachamim, and this is the opinion of Rabbi Yirmiyah Bar Abba. He says, Machlokes b'shir shel shoeva. The whole issue that divided Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim was only with regard to the singing at the time of the Nisach HaMayim. To Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Savar, Simcha Yisera Nami Dochi Es HaShabbos. Rashi says that there's something called Simchas Mitzvah. It's not part of the Avodah, but it's part of the Simcha of the Mitzvah. In the case of Nisach HaMayim, we have a great Simcha Shavta Mayim Sason, and for the sake of enhancing that Simcha, we will override the Shabbos. Rashi says, Hoil ubechalil ein iser malacha el shvus bi'alma. So we have a concept called shvus b'makom mitzvah, that the Rabbanon who instituted and enacted various gzeros on Shabbos they call shvutzim, in order to prevent us from violating an Isur. For example, they don't allow us to play instruments on Shabbos, lest one of the instruments break down and then we might be tempted to fix them on Shabbos, which would be a malacha makabipatik. So they prohibited playing instruments on Shabbos. But in the case of a mitzvah, like the great simcha of the yontif of Sukkot, when we do the Nitzach HaMayim, they would step aside and override, or shall we say, put the shvus on the back burners. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore, even when Sukkot coincided with Shabbos, he would allow playing the instruments on Shabbos for the sake of the mitzvah of Simcha. Rabbanan Savri, no. Simcha Yisera Eina Doches HaShabbos. For the sake of something that's not part of the avoda, it's not really connected to the Beis HaMikdash per se. It's just that we want to have the instruments playing in close proximity to the Nitzach HaMayim, but the instruments themselves are a separate independent mitzvah of Simcha to engender Simcha. That doesn't override the Shabbos. Why? Because the only time that we will suspend a shvus is when we're doing something that's related to the avoda in the mikdash. And since the instruments are not part of the avoda of the mikdash, but rather they enhance the simcha of Nisach HaMayim, they don't warrant overriding a shvus. Aval b'shir shel korban, divrei hakol avoda hividochas haShabbos. Here's the breakthrough of Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba. There was never a debate about playing instruments on Shabbos in order to enhance the korban itself. And why is that? Because now it's part of the avoda. The avoda is not just akrava, which was implemented by the Kohanim, it's also the shira, which was implemented by the Leviim, and the musical accompaniment to that shira, that also is part of the avodas hakarban. And anything that's part of the avodas hakarban will override a shvus d'Rabbanan of Shabbos. So now we have a double machlokes between Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef understood that there was never a machlokes about overriding the Shabbos for the sake of simcha, of instruments to enhance the joy and the celebration of Nisach HaMayim. That's not part of the avoda. And it was absolutely unanimously accepted that that could not override the Shabbos. Where was the machlokas according to Rabbi Yosef? Only in the case of Shira ala Karma. And since it's part of the avoda, that's why Rabbi Yossi was of the opinion that we could override the Shabbos. And now Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba disagrees with Rabbi Yosef on two counts. Number one, he's of the opinion that there was never a machlokas about Shira b'shas avoda, Shira shel Karma. Everybody agrees that that overrides the Shabbos, and to enhance the Shira ala Karban, we will allow for musical instruments to play. Now, in terms of Shira al Nisach HaMayim, here's where we have a machlokas. Rabbi Yossi says, for the sake of Simcha Yisera, we will override the shvus that prohibits us from playing instruments. And the Chachamim said, no, Simcha Yisera is something that's totally independent of the avoda, and therefore it doesn't cause a suspension of, warrant the suspension of the shvus of Shabbos. And at this point, the Gemara is going to support the opinion of Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba and raise an objection from a brisa against Rabbi Yosef. And this brisa that we're about to learn is almost explicit in favor of Rav Yirmiyah. Shir shel shoeva doches haShabbos. Now this is interesting. We're not even debating a shir shel karban. That for sure is doches haShabbos. The only issue is the shir of Nisach HaMayim, which is called the shir shoeva. According to the first opinion quoted in this brisa, Divrei Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, even the shir shel shoeva overrides the Shabbos. Af yontif ein doche. So again, we see clearly from this brisa that the entire machlokes, as recorded here, between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim, is limited to the case of Shir Shel Shoeva, implying that with regard to the Shir Shel Karban, everybody agrees that it's Docher Shabbos. Tiyuvta de Rabbi Yosef. How is Rabbi Yosef going to reconcile himself with this price? Tiyuvta. Tiyuvta means that at this point we really have no answer. However, the Gemara is going to take a little bit of a turn here. There was a double machlokes, if you recall, between Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba. And we rejected Rabbi Yosef with regard to Shoeva, Simcha Shel Shoeva, and Rabbi Yossi held clearly from the Brisa that it overrides the Shabbos. However, Lema, perhaps we could defend Rabbi Yosef at least on one count. B'shir Shel Shoeva hu depligi. It's a machlokas between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim about whether or not the shir of Shoeva as a separate independent mitzvah of Simcha, that's not part of the Avodas HaKarban, overrides the Shabbos. Aval b'shir shel Karban, divrei hakol doches HaShabbos. Do we derive now another conclusion to shlug up Rabbi Yosef, namely that as far as shir shel Karban, even the Chachamim concede that we override the Shabbos, and then Lema Tiyuvta Rabbi Yosef Tarte. Now we've completely smashed Rabbi Yosef, not only with regard to the shir of Shoeva, but even with regard to the shir of Karban. Rabbi Yosef, no, don't go that far. You got me on one count, but you don't get me on two counts. Pligi b'shir shel Shoeva v'hu adin l'Karban. Meaning, to the same extent that the Chachamim objected to override and suspend the shvus of Shabbos that prohibits playing instruments for the sake of shir shel Shoeva, they would maintain the same position with regard to shir shel Karban. But then you'll ask me the question, so why did they argue in shir shel Shoeva? They should have argued in shir shel Karban to tell me a bigger chiddush that the Rabbanan will not suspend the shvus, not in favor of a separate mitzvah of Simcha in Shir Shel Shoeva, not even when the Shira is part of the Avodas HaKarban. And the Gemara answers, why did this price record the machlokas only with regard to Shir Shel Shoeva? That he was of the opinion that not only, it goes without saying, that the Shir Shel Karban overrides the Shabbos, but even the Shir Shel Shoeva for Nisach HaMayim overrides the Shabbos. But as far as the Shita, the Chachamim are concerned, the Chachamim would say, in both cases, we do not override the Shabbos. Not in the case of Shoeva, and not even in the case of Karban. The Gemara doesn't like it. For Haketani, let's look at the language of the Brisa very carefully. It says, Zechalil shel beis HaShoeva, she'ena dochelos HaShabbos v'los HaYontif. And the Brisa now, which reflects also the language of our Mishnah, says Zechalil, the word Zeh, followed by ena doche los HaShabbos, and certainly los HaYontif, and even Loas HaYontif, that's talking only about Shoeva. Zechalil, because the Rabbanan in the case of Shoeva are of the opinion that it's an independent mitzvah of Simcha, it's part of the celebration, Shavtamai B'Sason, and it's not part of the Avod. Zeu di'ena doche, the extra word Zeu is to teach me that only in the case of Shoeva it doesn't override the Shabbos. Aval de Karban doche. But in a case of Karban, when the Shira will accompany the Avoda itself, that would certainly override the Shabbos. Mani, now we'll make a simple calculation. To whom can we attribute the authorship of these Tanoic statements? Here the Brisa and the Mishnah itself says that Chalil shel beis hashoeva eino doche los Shabbos osiot. That's against Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. Elalav, we have no choice, but the Rabbanan. And yet the Rabbanan are saying in this brisa that with regard to shir shel karma, certainly it would be doche Shabbos tufta the Rabbi Yosef bitarte. This brisa contradicts Rabbi Yosef on both counts. Gemara asks the following: my time of demand the Omar ikar shir bekli. Let's get back to the machlokas as to whether or not the main primary shira is the vocal singing or the instrumental singing. It's instrumental based on a pasuk in Divrei Hayom, Tichsiv, Vayomer Chizkiyo lahalos ha'ola lamizbeach. Again, what this ola is, we'll have to learn later on in a different daf. Ubi'eis heichel ha'ola, when they began to be makriv the ola, heichel shir Hashem, they began the shira to accompany the akrov of the ola. Ve'achatzotzos, v'al klei David melech Yisrael. Look at the emphasis here on klei David. These are the musical instruments. And the pasuk goes out of its way to emphasize that they are part of the karma. And my time of the Omar, demand the Omar, ikar shir b'peh, he has a different pasuk in Divrei Yomim where the instruments are completely omitted. So they were talking about the songs, the vocal songs, and that's called Lashmiya Kol. And they're talking about the trumpets, which is part of the Simcha of a Karban, where the instruments. They're completely omitted. Why ignore that? The answer is because Ikar Shira B'peh, instrument is just a cherry on top. It's just to enhance the beauty of the singing. So now the Gemara says we have these two psukim. Let's now match them up the other way. The Idoch Nami, if you hold that the Ikar Shira is B'peh, Haksiv Vayomer Chizkiyo, and Chizkiyo in that pasuk ends with Klei David Melech Yisrael. Hachikama, Echel Shir Hashem, and now we add a word to the pasuk B'peh. That's the Shir Hashem, and Al Yidei Klei David Melech Yisrael L'Bsumei Kala. L'Bsumei Kala means that the voices of the Kohanim are a little bit coarse, a little bit thick. You know, we want to soften them and refine them, so we add a musical background. And the instruments give a sweetness to the sound of the Shira Salavim. That's called the Besume Kala. But don't make any mistake about it. The Klei David here are not playing an essential role in Shira. They're just playing a background music in order to enhance the sound of the Shira B'peh. V'idach Nami. But if you hold that Ikar Shir B'kli, what are you going to do with this pasuk that we quoted here, which completely omits the instruments? Haksiv, it says, and yet there's no mention whatsoever of the kelim, of the instruments. Hachi kamar mishorim dumya de mechatzitrim. The mechatzitrim are the trumpet players. And now we're interpreting the Mishorim in an analogy to the trumpet players. Just like the trumpet players are playing instruments, in this case the trumpet, Mamachatzim B'kli, Af Mishorim B'kli, those who sang the songs also would be accompanied by the musical instruments. And now we start the Mishnah, a very long and detailed Mishnah that describes the Nisach HaMayim. And first we go back a little bit to the nighttime that precedes the day of Nisach HaMayim. So Nisach HaMayim begins on the second day of Sukkot. And we're going to prepare this all before that day, as we'll see. The greatest manifestation of Simcha, and that is in the Beis Hamikdash, was the She'iva, the drawing of the water from the Mei HaShiloach for the purpose of Nisach HaMayim. B'motzai Yontif Harishon Shel Chag. So now we're past the first day of Yontif, and we're the night going into the second day, the day that we begin the process and the mitzvah of Nisach HaMayim. At that time, Yardu Li'ezras Noshim, the Kohanim and the Leviim made a tikkun gadol. Why? Because the She'iva celebration is going to take place in the Ezras Noshim. And Chazal were worried that dafka at a time of great simcha, there's a possibility that the men and women will gather together and there'll be something that we think is totally inappropriate for the Beis Hamikdash. So therefore, Mesachnin Sham Tikkun Gadol. We'll soon see that they built balconies so that the lady folk could climb out to the balconies and participate in the simcha. But since they were upstairs, and you can see this, by the way, in ancient synagogues, like, for example, I don't know if you've ever been to Prague, for example, there's a beautiful shul called the Klois Shul. You'll see the Ezras Noshim on top. And I was in a shul in Clanton Park in Toronto for 2 years, on Levismore, and there also the women were on top, on the balcony. And that creates a separation. I mean, you may ask, well, why during such a holy simcha would there be mixing, frivolity and so forth between men and women? But you find even at funerals, the Gemara says, that the men and women in the procession had to be separated. Okay. Now, one of the great tools or methods for increasing simcha, especially at night, is light. How did they intensify the light around the Beis Hamikdash during the Shoeva celebration? Menoros shel zav hayusham. They had beautiful menorahs. They were very tall. Chazal say they reached a height so that when they lit the menorah, the light could be seen all over the city of Yerushalayim. Every last courtyard and passageway in Yerushalayim was lit up by these menorahs. We don't know how many menorahs there were. Some say there were 2. Some say there were as many as 4. There were 4 golden bowls that would contain the oil. And we'll soon see that the Pirchei Kahuna would be in charge of taking that oil on top that were suspended, so to speak, on top of the menorah, and they would pour the oil into the menorah, and they would climb up the arbas sulamos l'kol echad v'echad. That means that if there were 4 golden bowls that were very high up, let's assume, again, just to make life easy, that there were 4 menorahs. It doesn't say in the Mishnah how many there were. Let's throw out the number 4. Why? Why am I choosing 4? Because then you have 4 bowls of oil, golden bowls. Each bowl corresponds to each one of the menorahs. And now we have 4 Pirchei Kahuna. Arba Yeladim the Pirchei Kahuna, B'yadeim Kadim Shel Mea V'Esrim Lu. So these 4 youngsters, what's called Pirchei Kahuna, that's the future of Klal Yisrael, they would climb up, each one a ladder respectively, in order to light the candles, to light the menorah. And how much oil did they carry in these jugs as they climbed up to the top of the menorah. 120 lug in each bowl. Rabosai, I don't know if we're learning something al derech hateva, or there was a great miracle. This just doesn't jive. The menorah was 30 amma high. You're carrying a bowl of 120 lug of oil, and you're climbing 30 amma with a youngster who's pirchei kahuna. To me, that sounds very dangerous. They matilin lechol sefel v'sefel. Each one of the four pirchei kahuna would pour his content of oil in the kadim, in those pitchers, into one of the bowls that we spoke about that were situated on top of the menorah. One ladder for each bowl, one bowl for each one of the pirchei kahuna. Now, what were the wicks? You know, we call the menorah a candle. A candle has to have a wick. They wanted to make the wicks from something that had a sanctity to it. Mibloi michsasei kohanim umehem yonehem. They used the michnasayim. You know, there were big day kahuna. The kohanim hijotim were four begadim, one of which was the michnasayim. And after a certain period of time, it got disintegrated, and they took it out of service, and they used it to make wicks. Also, the kohanim used to have to wear belts, and the belts would get worn out, and they would be used for a mitzvah of Simchas Beis HaShoeva to make the wicks. So they would tear it up and cut it into wicks, and then they would be madlik. Who are the dancers at the head of the show, in the center of the circle? They were Hasidim and Anshe Maisa. Okay, the fact that they were Hasidim, that doesn't surprise me. Hasidim always dance, although these aren't the Hasidim that we're talking about, but they were Anshe Maisa. Later on, we'll see in the Mishnayos how this was all part of the process of tshuva that culminated on Sukkah. Although the process of tshuva began Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, but the apex of tshuva was during the Simchas Beis HaShoeva celebration on Sukkah.